Of all the theatrically released sequels Disney has made, Ralph Breaks the Internet may just be the worst among them, as I further explained in my video on the movie, which you can find a link in the description to. But rather than compare everything this movie did wrong to any number of ones that didn't for the 100th time, today I would like to do something a little different and actually give this movie credit for something that it did right, or at least tried to do right. Because even Wreck-It Ralph itself wasn't perfect, as I detailed in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to. So it's only natural that Ralph Breaks the Internet wouldn't be the worst movie of all time, and have its good points, as few as they may be. And there will be spoilers for both Wreck-It Ralph movies ahead, so in case you haven't seen either of them yet and don't want to know how they end, please feel free to come back to this video another day. Now, if you're a frequent watcher of my channel, you'll already know that one of the biggest issues with Ralph Breaks the Internet is that Ralph needs to learn not to be obsessed with his friends and let them live their own lives. And as I've always maintained, that such a lesson was one that the character didn't need to learn. And I most definitely still stand by that, as the Ralph from the original just wanted respect, and was never shown to have obsessive tendencies or a desperate need for approval from others. However, when looked at from an objective standpoint divorced from that, the moral itself in isolation does work. It is one that's good to tell people, and Ralph's speech to the virus does a pretty good job of summing up that even though it's hard, a good friend is one that does what's best for those they care about and is willing to let them live their dreams regardless of how it impacts them. Basically, the moral itself is a good one. It's the way the film goes about presenting it that's the real problem. Because even apart from the fact that they're using a character that never needed to learn this lesson in order to get it across, there's also that it doesn't even do a great job of conveying that message. Again, it's all in the execution that things become messy. Because first of all, it's extremely heavy-handed. Even if Ralph was set up better as somebody who needed to learn to let go of his insecurities in the previous film, this still wouldn't be a great payoff for it, since the film repeatedly bashes the viewer over the head with the fact that Ralph's behavior is unhealthy, and that his desperate need for a friend is only going to drive her away. And not to mention, even if that final speech is very applicable, as I just got through saying, it's still pretty on the nose with what it wants the audience to take away from the story. And as I brought up in my video on Raya and the Last Dragon, people really don't like it when a film makes it too obvious what it's trying to say, and Ralph Breaks the Internet is arguably just as guilty of that, especially because it has Ralph act very over the top with his behavior just to make sure the viewer gets the hint that he's supposed to be in the wrong. But what only makes the execution of said moral worse is that, similar to Raya and the Last Dragon, it arguably subverts the entire lesson that it's trying to convey, because Vanellope was the first real friend Ralph had, and at least according to this film, her approval of him is his validation and self-worth, which is portrayed as a bad thing. But what isn't is that Vanellope deciding on the fly to abandon her video game for another without consulting anybody whom this might affect, and that isn't indeed a lot of people, not just Ralph. In other words, Ralph is presented as being in the wrong for not considering Vanellope's feelings, as he should, but Vanellope is presented as in the right for doing the exact same thing, not considering the feelings of not only Ralph, but countless others. So as a result, that makes the final resolution between the two look very one-sided and hypocritical, as Ralph has to do all of the learning while Vanellope is never made to own up to her behavior, even though she did the exact same thing he did. Sure, maybe it's not to the same extent, but the fact that she's unambiguously presented as in the right when she's just as guilty of being selfish and inconsiderate as Ralph is, and never has to own up to it, makes Ralph learning a lesson and applying it not mean nearly as much, because they both went about trying to make their dreams come true the wrong way, and only Ralph's forced to admit it, while Vanellope is congratulated for it. And needless to say, that is not a good way to get a moral across, as this double standard can easily call everything that Ralph learns into question, since Vanellope doesn't need to learn it for no discernible reason. And not to mention, even though it's made clear that Ralph's obsession with Vanellope is fueled solely by wanting a friend and nothing else, that still doesn't change the fact that having a grown man be so obsessed with a little girl comes across as needlessly creepy. Especially because, even though it was most definitely unintentional, a lot of Ralph's behavior mirrors that of groomers or other people that want to take advantage of children. Specifically that he spends a ton of time with her, wants her to be emotionally dependent on him, gets very jealous when she forms a connection to somebody else and tries to do everything he can to drive a wedge between her and the other person, doesn't want her to leave his side for too long, and hugs her a lot. Yeah, it is way too easy to get the wrong idea from this film between their age gap and Ralph's clingy behavior. And the worst part is that Disney didn't need to do any of it. Seriously, who honestly thought it was a good idea to portray the nice adult everyman from the first film as viewing a little girl as his friend to an obsessive degree, especially because such subtext isn't present in the original at all, as he comes across as more of a mentor figure to her than anything else. At least in something like Frozen 2, where the characters deal with similar issues, it comes across as a lot less creepy, both because Anna actually has a precedence for being a bit obsessed with Elsa, and because they're sisters, making their connection way more justified. And there's also that it's not taken to the same over-the-top levels as it is with Ralph either. But seriously, if Disney was that desperate to tell a story about an unhealthy friendship, Ralph Breaks the Internet was not the time for it. But before I ruin Ralph's character even further, there is one other thing about the way the moral is conveyed that doesn't work all that well, and it's one that most people wouldn't consider, even though I've talked about it many times before. Specifically that it's not only very on the nose, but too mature for children to understand. I mean, what Ralph has to say is on such a therapeutic level that some teenagers might have a hard time getting the gist of what he's saying. So how on earth is a child supposed to get it? Now don't get me wrong here, as I already stressed in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too, I do believe that children are smarter than they're given credit for and can pick up on a lot of stuff. But that doesn't change the fact that they just can't understand some things until they reach a certain age, and Ralph's speech at the end of the film isn't really dumbed down enough for them. And if you don't believe me on that, take another listen to it and honestly try to tell me that it's meant for children. Everything about it was clearly meant for the parents watching and nobody else, and I frankly think that's a problem. Especially because as Zootopia 2 proved, Disney's only gotten more complex in that department. Because if a kid's movie is trying to send the adults a message to the point that it goes right over the children's heads, then what are they really learning from it? But even apart from that, one also has to keep in mind that children are often obsessive, impulsive, and possessive by nature. That's just the way they are. So telling them that being so attached to somebody else is a bad thing and could actually be hurting the other person can make them question their own friendships even if they're perfectly healthy ones for their age, because they won't be able to pick up on the nuances of what it's really saying. Because again, two 8-year-olds being practically joined at the hip and doing everything together is completely normal for kids and even somewhat encouraged as it helps along their developmental process. But if two adults were to behave the same way, most would agree that's unhealthy. So the fact that the movie takes the adult route with how it depicts Ralph and Vanellope's friendship can cause needless confusion in children, since most kids aren't likely to be so obsessed with a friend that it's a legitimate problem like Ralph is to Vanellope. And as I noted before, the fact that adults have been noted to take what Ralph says to heart in spite of its heavy-handedness only further shows exactly who this movie was made for, and the children that should be its target audience may very well suffer for it. Now, as I've stressed many times, Ralph Breaks the Internet is far from the only kids movie in the new millennium to suffer from this problem, but it's arguably one of the worst, if only because the moral could end up doing more harm than good because of the way it's conveyed. And on a lighter note, what child wants to see a movie where the climax turns into a therapy session? Sure, other movies have done similar things to great success, but here it just comes across as kind of anticlimactic. So, like I said at the start, in isolation, the moral behind Ralph Breaks the Internet is a pretty good and effective one, and the problems with it lie solely in its completely botched execution. As I've argued many times before, having Ralph be insecure and emotionally dependent on Vanellope to an unhealthy degree was a bad idea from the word go, and not just because it accidentally makes Ralph look like a creep, but also because it was a lesson that he never needed to learn in the first place, which only makes an already badly thought out idea even more flawed. To put it simply, the writer screwed up what they wanted to say so badly that it's impossible for most to take the final product at face value, with only those with an open enough mind able to appreciate his final speech by itself without everything surrounding it, and even that isn't too many people. But to once again give credit where it's due, when divorced from any and all context, the lesson Ralph Breaks the Internet tries to teach isn't a bad one, and it only doesn't work because of the terrible way it's presented. Okay, I think I've made my point here. So now why don't you tell me? Do you think that the moral behind Ralph Breaks the Internet does work in isolation, even if the film should have still probably gone in a completely different direction? Or do you believe that it's just as bad as everything else it has to offer? Or alternatively, do you think that Ralph Breaks the Internet is a masterpiece and that I'm being way too hard on it? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because please understand that any and all opinions expressed in this video are simply that, opinions, and you are under no obligation to agree with any of them if you don't want to. And thank you all for watching. It is all really appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.